Welcome. My name is Clay Whitehead, and I'm your host and moderator for today's webinar, the third and final in our Blueprints for Success Fall Series. I'm also CEO of Presence Learning. We have sponsored this online professional development program now in its fifth year, and we continue to be excited about the potential to work together to change the lives of children with special needs. Our online therapy and diagnostic services are making a real impact for special educators and thousands of students every day. And our Sped Ahead webinar series has attracted close to 100,000 participants. Wow. Did you know that this webinar had nearly 6,000 registrants from districts all across the United States? It's really unbelievable, and it's thanks to you listeners. Back in September, Dr. Howie Knopf started the series with a comprehensive look at what it takes to build effective social, emotional, behavioral skills programs. The blueprint he unfolded for us was like the plan for a social, emotional, behavioral skyscraper. So, for all of us who are helping kids with mental health challenges and looking for ways to improve school climate and minimize the need for disciplinary actions, this was quite the presentation. The recording of this webinar is like a great movie that you can watch and appreciate over and over, so check it out and share it with your colleagues. You can also find it on demand in the Presence Learning webinar archives. October wasn't just a time to celebrate Halloween. We are celebrating the turnout and response we received from the second webinar in the Blueprint series with Dr. Jeannie Wanzek. Jeannie walked us through proven constructs for literacy and reading interventions, the most critical skill sets we need to develop for success in school and to prepare our students for their careers. The recording of Dr. Wanzek's hour-long webinar, as well as her answers to many questions submitted by the audience, is ready for you now on the Presence Learning website. Today, we are bringing the series to a close, and last, but certainly not least, is a simply amazing educator, Dr. Carol Tomlinson. I'm sure most of you know Carol and her work, and I'll give you a snapshot of that. But before I do, let me say that it's obvious for special educators that a one-size-fits-all approach to teaching and learning does not work. And while we all know and appreciate the need to differentiate and personalize instruction, we cannot do it alone. Special education leaders have led the charge and created a vision that helps teachers and everyone in our schools, and parents too, to understand that differentiation is essential. And who better to inspire us to do that than Dr. Carol Ann Tomlinson, a world-respected leader and the chief architect of differentiated instruction. Her background and credentials are a blueprint of success. Dr. Tomlinson's career includes 21 years as a public school teacher and 12 years as a program administrator of special services for struggling and advanced learners. She is a William Clay Parrish Jr. professor and chair of the Educational Leadership Foundations and Policy, and co-director of the Institutes on Academic Diversity at the University of Virginia Curry School of Education. Special interests throughout Carol's career have included curriculum and instruction for struggling and advanced learners, effective instruction in heterogeneous settings, and encouraging creative and critical thinking in the classroom. Dr. Tomlinson has authored numerous books, articles, and studies on differentiated instruction. Her books have been translated into 12 languages. She delivers presentations and consultations throughout the U.S. and abroad for educators whose goal is to develop more inclusive classrooms that offer the best learning environments for all students to succeed. Carol, we are thrilled to have you with us as we close out our Blueprints for Success series today. Welcome, and it's over to you.
Good afternoon. Thanks to Clay Whitehead. I'm grateful also to Presence Learning for making it possible for us to share this webinar together, and also want to acknowledge the work of Howie Knopf and Jean Wanzek, whose work has come before mine in this series. I think one thing that all of us share in common is the desire to help develop blueprints of success for the students that all of us, in one way or another, work to support. What I'd like to talk with you about today is a blueprint for success which asks you to think about your work in a slightly broader way than perhaps many of us often do with the busyness of day-to-day life. And that is, I'd like to encourage you to think more about yourself as a leader for change on behalf of the students that we all serve together, rather than a person who has a fairly defined job to do and going to do that job even very well. The work that we have ahead of us in dealing with academic diversity effectively in today's classroom is massively large. There'll also be a reference booklet for you that contains these materials that I'm going to share with you, as well as some other things that can be of use to you while you're thinking about these points, both today and certainly at a later time with the guide. So what we'll do today is take a look at what it would really mean to think about your job in the context of leadership for more effectively responsive classrooms and what some guidelines for that might be. 10 ways that we can draw on the expertise of people who think about these things really often, so that as we continue to do our day-to-day work, we see it in the larger picture as well. What would it look like if we created a place where far more kids have equity of access to excellent instruction? It would be a wonderful thing if every school principal had a clear vision for why inclusive teaching makes a difference. And I think most principals would really like to see that happen, but it isn't always their chief area of understanding or of emphasis because they just have so many extraneous pressures on them. So sometimes people in positions like those that you hold can be the architects of the vision. You can certainly do it by talking with people that you interact with about why this work matters and why it matters to their students and to them. So principle number 1, work from why. One of the most important things in supporting change is to have a vision for that change that's compelling and that can help other people feel that it's worth the investment of their time to make that change. Leaders inspire people to do better. Leaders don't mandate, argue, give edicts. Real leaders show people a vision which they'll be willing to follow, even when it's complex. In addition to being architects for a vision for change, we really need many people who take it on as a part of their responsibility to help propagate a clear definition of what needs to happen in classrooms when learners are diverse, and in all classrooms, learners are diverse. So a second principle that really matters for leadership on behalf of students who need some adaptations in a classroom is that we need to have a clear definition of what differentiation means, and then to work to be sure that everybody knows it and understands it. It's my experience that if I'm in a school with, let's say, 40 teachers, there are at least 40 different definitions of differentiation. And every one of those has been created by a teacher based on his or her beliefs and current experience with teaching. The problem with that great hodgepodge of definitions is that it keeps us from having very clear targets for ourselves as professionals, and certainly at least as much to the point, if not more, from really understanding what it is that we're trying to do to benefit the students in our class. So on behalf of the second principle, knowing what clear definition of differentiation is, I'd like to suggest just a couple to you. When I first began working at the university after 20 years in a public school classroom, I probably would have told you that differentiation was a set of instructional strategies that you use to help kids be able to do different things in a task, and by doing those different things, be more likely to achieve success. I've come to understand in my 20 years at the university that the classroom really is a system with interdependent parts, and that anything we try to do that's worthwhile and powerful and durable calls on us to understand all of those parts and how they work for us or against us. So I would now tell you that my definition of differentiation focuses on 5 key elements in a classroom. And here's what those are. I think we have to create a learning environment that actively supports student growth. A classroom where kids come with trust and enthusiasm and a willingness to put forth effort because they truly believe and see that it's working for them. At the very least, that takes a teacher with a growth mindset who believes in the possibility of kids. It takes a teacher who's willing to work continually to develop meaningful teacher-student connections. And it takes a teacher who wants to build a team of learners, a community where people support one another in growth. Differentiation to me also means that we have to have really clear indicators of what student success will look like. what are our KUDs? In other words, what must students know, the K? What must they understand, the U? And what must they be able to do, the D, as a result of today's lesson, this learning segment, this week, this unit, this month, this semester, this year? Short of those learning targets, the imprecision really makes it very difficult for us to teach with clarity and for kids to learn with clarity. And for people who work with students who have special needs, what often happens when we lack real clarity is that it becomes the job of the teachers who work with kids in special contexts just to make sure they learn everything. And of course, for many students who have special ed needs, that's not going to happen. We have to know what really matters most and why it matters and be able to focus there. So we need to have clear learning targets. We need to plan our curriculum with engaging kids. If we can't engage their minds, we've lost before they start. And many times we teach things that are really just plain out flat or ambiguous or boring, and that will never take us very far. And we have to be sure that our curriculum supports student understanding. That's critical for all students, but particularly for kids who have learning difficulties that make it unlikely that they're going to quickly learn a lot of data and master it and give it back. That need to understand what this is about and how it works is really critical. If that piece is missing, we can't be appropriately responsive to kids in a diverse classroom. I suspect many of you know the work of John Hattie, but if not, he's probably considered to be certainly one of the most, if not the most influential educational researcher of our times. And in talking about responsive classrooms or differentiation, here's what he says. It seems like just common sense. He says teachers have to know where their students are, and they have to aim to move those students +1 beyond whatever their starting point was. So the idea of teaching the class as a whole is unlikely to pitch the lesson correctly for all students because the students are going to be at different starting points. This notion of trying to figure out where the kids are so that you can move each one ahead +1, he says, is where it's really important to know the similarities across students, but also to definitely allow for the differences that they bring to school with them. A third thing that really is critical is, and this sort of goes back to Hattie, we really have to know where each student is relative to the particular set of goals or KUDs that we're working with now. And what that means is that we need to have clear goals and then develop pre-assessments and formative assessments that absolutely align with those goals. We need to use those assessments faithfully to monitor where students are throughout the learning process. And we need to then use what we see as we analyze those formative assessments in order to plan instruction that works well for each student. In other words, I see a group of kids here who are misunderstanding this point. I see some students who have a gap in vocabulary. I see some students who are ready to move on. As we look for those patterns, we see what Hattie's talking about, what kids need to hold in common and what things they don't now hold in common, and that enables us to plan our instruction much more effectively. I really have a good evolving sense of where kids are as individuals and as a group relative to these tasks, so that now I understand what everybody's +1 step is. And now I'm going to choose instructional strategies that will help me reach out to kids in ways that move them along this continuum of progress that we're all seeking, but in ways that let them start where they are currently. We get to the point where we say, okay, kids are comfortable in this place. They're willing to give it their best. I have really powerful curriculum that I really believe can inspire kids to learn. And finally, we need teachers who understand what it means to lead their students, who understand how to manage routines so that they can be flexible. To do that, it means that we need to be leaders of kids, to help them understand with our own personal vision what it would be like to try to create a classroom that actually works for everybody, and how we can do that together. When teachers inspire kids to be their teammates in that way, it leaves all sorts of possibilities open for us. And in the end, what we're trying to do in those classrooms is establish a good balance between the flexibility that different kids need in order to learn and the predictability that all of us need to be able to figure out how the classroom is going to work. So for me, no matter what your role is, any way that you intersect with the classroom, it's important to look at how this particular classroom is doing in each of those elements separately, and to understand that really good teaching for any students, including those who have special learning needs, happens when all of these elements turn together. This visual is one I really like because looking at it, I can really see in a very clear image what's going to happen if one of those elements slows down or stops or goes backwards or begins moving randomly or too quickly. Really important for us to be able to think about those 5 elements and how they work together. And so this is really for folks who are willing to think about what responsive classrooms would involve so that their own thinking is clearer and they can then lead folks up the leadership chain to think about these things. For me, differentiation is a pre-planned response based on formative assessment to learners' needs, not just, oh my goodness, he doesn't get it, so let me run over there and see what I can do right now. Shaped by a teacher's mindset, a teacher who believes in the capacity of a brain to grow like a body can is in a much better position to teach kids of all sorts than a teacher who believes that some kids have it and some kids don't. It's really important in differentiation that we think about those 5 elements that I just mentioned to you. A really terrific learning environment, high-quality curriculum, assessment that we use for informing teaching and learning, instruction that responds to the variance that kids bring with them to the classroom, and then leading kids and managing the classroom so that there's a balance of stability and flexibility. We can differentiate content, which is either what the kids need to learn or how they're going to access it, and both of those can be important. We can differentiate process, which is a synonym for a sense-making activity, how kids practice and come to own what they're supposed to learn. We can differentiate products. Those are summative things that come at the end of big chunks of learning so that kids have an opportunity to show us what they've come away with, what they can demonstrate that they've learned. And we can differentiate both the affect and learning environment in the classroom. All of those things can be really critical for students with special learning needs and for other students as well. And we can differentiate content, process, product, affect, and learning environment based on kids' readiness needs, their particular personal interests, and various approaches to learning, or all 3 of those. And we do that frequently by the instructional strategies we choose, by whether we use learning menus, learning contracts, choice of activities, graphic organizers, scaffolded reading, recorded text, any number of strategies that we reach out to use to benefit kids. But no matter what those strategies are, we need to be clear on whether we're differentiating content, process, product, or affect based on kids' readiness, interest, learning profile, and to be keenly aware of how those 5 elements shape what we're doing in the classroom. So, second principle, really important for us to have clarity of direction, clarity of definition as we design and help other people design blueprints for success for students. So, continuing to look at the elements of blueprints that leaders for student success tend to follow. Third, it's really important for us to understand why it's so hard for teachers to change their practice in order to differentiate instruction. Most of you are familiar with working with kids who find some areas of their lives difficult to change. And if we just tell them to change and then they don't, we become ultimately angry. We see them as perverse. But if we understand the psychology, the physiology, the habit, all of the above behind why they're doing what they're doing, it makes us much more understanding of the student and much more understanding of a path we need to follow to help them grow. And the same thing's true with teachers and changing their classroom practice. They understand the power that that could have in their classrooms, and yet it's still hard for them to change. And I want to suggest to you one way of thinking about why it's tough to change. People who write about this talk about something they call the deep structures of schooling. And these are images, feelings, sort of a how we do things here scheme that we develop in our heads as human beings, largely because we have sat through fairly traditional K through 12 and then university classes. But we really have come to believe that a good teacher is a teller, and good teaching is telling. We've come to believe that a good student is one who absorbs what we told as the teacher and can give it back to us. Curriculum is something that we cover. Kids are dependent and incapable. If we're not standing on top of them, they can't do what they're asked to do and will totally stray off task, and chaos will ensue. Lessons are something about the subject, and they used to be just related in a pleasant, sort of fun kind of way. Now they've just gotten to be drill and practice on facts and skills. Pedagogy we even refer to as our bag of tricks, not something that we see as a tool for really precise working with kids' needs, but just sort of another trick that we have that we can pull out in the classroom. We still largely see assessment as something that comes at the end to see who got it. We have great difficulty making sure that it's really aligned with those goals or KUDs. And we'd really love to think that assessment is purely objective and it will tell us what a kid really is, what they know, what they can do. We can enter a number in the grade book and we know what we need to know. We still look at control as a synonym for management rather than good leadership as a synonym for management. We still largely believe that fair is treating everyone alike. And we see grades as normative, objective, and one of its major purposes is to separate sheep from goats. In your resource package, you will have a page that looks like this, and you can take some time to study it and add to it if you'd like. What this is suggesting is that each of those deep structure beliefs that you see along the left-hand side of the matrix has certain implications for the key elements of differentiation, the environment, curriculum, instruction, assessment, and so on. And when you really stop to think about the fact that if we possess any or all of these deep structure beliefs, which many, many, many of us do, the vast majority, it's going to cause erosion in those cogs that needed to turn together. And so rather than just simply saying, let's give the kid this with a checklist and he'll follow it for us, or just have to be more firm here. It's really just about giving out rewards and punishments. So another really important principle of trying to help teachers change and trying to help other people help teachers change is to understand why it's hard, even when they get why it would be wise to create more responsive classrooms, why it's so incredibly difficult for them to do that. We've looked briefly at the importance of having a vision for change, the importance of contributing to a clear definition of where we're trying to go, the importance of understanding what sorts of teacher patterns, habits, misconceptions lead to the difficulty of change. And I'd like for us to look now briefly at a fourth principle, and that is to really understand a term that experts in school change use and how that might relate to the roles that we need to play in order to make change happen. Real change is uncomfortable for people. Somebody said once that the only person who likes change is a wet baby. Change suggests to us that we must be doing something wrong or we wouldn't have to change. It makes us uncomfortable. It makes us afraid. And there's sort of degrees of that fear and discomfort. And it's really critical for us to understand a distinction between what some experts call first-order school change and second-order change. First-order change allows us to just sort of tweak or tinker with the things that we already do. So somebody can come into our school and say, look, here's a set of graphic organizers. If you use this one in math and this one in writing, kids will understand better. Have a nice day. And sure enough, keeping the same kind of environment we've got, the same approach to curriculum, the same sort of uses of assessment, we can go in and show our kids how to use those organizers in the subjects for which they're appropriate and keep right on going, and they integrate in there rather nicely. That's first-order change. It takes place within existing paradigms. It allows us to hang on to prevailing norms and values, and we don't have to really change our knowledge and skills much to do that. second order change is much more complex. It basically says to us, you know what, we can't keep going with the past here. And we're going to have to change the whole paradigm we look at. And it's going to sometimes really conflict with the beliefs and practices we've already had. And by the way, it's going to take a whole batch of new knowledge and skills to implement this. Now, hopefully no leader or partner in their right mind would say that second batch of things to anybody, but those of us who try to lead need to understand that. What people who study this as a career tell us is that first order change is much easier, but it never really changes the core of what needs to change in a school. If you want schools to change significantly so that they become much more effective for far more kids, second order change is what we're talking about. And it's difficult, and we need leaders who understand that difficulty. We need people in all sorts of positions like the ones you have to work with other leaders to understand the complexity of this and to plan accordingly. And we'll look at the planning piece in just a bit. In second order change, there are a number of things that happen that are kind of interesting. But first, I want to suggest to you that it's a very long journey. Most people tell us, most research bears out, that if we want to make those significant, powerful, substantial changes in schools, we're looking at a minimum investment of consistent work over a 5 to 7 year period. And even at the end of that time, it's not finished. Initially, it's not always too hard to get teachers to be enthusiastic about the possibility of a change. If we're using a vision, and if that vision makes sense to teachers, most of us really want to change if we think it's going to benefit our students. And so early on in an initiation stage, it's a great time to talk about what benefit we and our students might accrue from this. It's a great time to establish some definitions. It's a great time to look at some images, read books together, have presenters come in and paint a picture for us. And usually that's, if it's done well, teachers are kind of okay with that. You know, maybe I can get something here. Maybe it'll be all right. But in this long span where we move from introducing something to saying, okay, let's try some of this in our classrooms, frequently we hit what's called an implementation dip. And at that time, many, many teachers will sort of say to themselves, not always aloud to us, I don't think so. I don't like this. Takes too much time. Don't have enough materials. Don't have the partnership to plan this. Nope, this isn't going to work. And what frequently happens is that those of us who are in leadership positions kind of panic with them, and things just sort of dissipate and disband. Leaders need to understand that implementation dip and to do what's necessary to understand where teachers are, to hear their various concerns because they're not all the same people, to help them develop tools and images for what this looks like, to be right there working with them, to be a set of hands, another comrade in planning, and to realize that it's going to take quite a while for these changes to really take deep root. We've talked for many, many years, decades now, about a teaching model that looks kind of like this in a classroom. First, the teacher shows students something to do by teaching them about it and modeling it for them. And then the teacher does it with the kids as a class as a whole, and they work on it together. And then the teacher sets up some support. And you try this by yourself, but there's a little help here if you need it. Here's how you can get some support if you need it. And finally, now do it on your own. If we want second order change to happen with teachers, we have to do this as well. We need people like you who will be there to say, I'll show you. I'll model it for you. Okay, now that we've done that a few times, let's try this together. Now, you try it next time, and the next time, and the next time, but I'll be in here to be a second set of hands. And ultimately, got to leave you for a bit now, so do it on your own, but I'll be back to talk with you about it. If we skip any of these stages, we can't help people grow in a systematic way that is feasible to them and durable. And often what we do in schools is go from an introductory presentation training kind of model to, okay, now you do it yourself. And there's absolutely no way that teachers can figure out what those steps are. One of the great gifts of working with people like you is that you can help us understand the students, classroom structures, what may and may not work for particular kids, what instructional strategies are there, many, many things that would benefit them. And so we need to set up work like the work that many of you all contribute to so that teachers are getting some sort of training, presentation, reading, whatever, then teaching and modeling by people like you, then shared attempts at teaching, and then guided support, and then independent practice. And if we move too quickly through those stages, it's not very likely that teachers will go anywhere with us. That's just a tiny bit about the notion of second-order change, but it's really, really critical. It's change for the long haul. It's change where leaders know there are going to be ups and downs, and they're ready for those. So the fifth idea that I'd like to share with you is a brief one, but very important. And that is that the principal of a school is in an extraordinarily important role for making change happen. There's a role for central office people, there's a role for assistant principals, there's a role for curriculum coordinators, there's a role for teachers, but that principal is typically at the helm of the change. And unless the principal is really sort of driving the boat, school-wide change just almost never happens. And so what that suggests is that it's really important for people in all sorts of roles to see themselves as a partner with the principal in trying to move change forward. Some principals seek that out and are happy to have it, really solicit it. Other principals are busy, not certain, feel threatened if somebody says something. And that's not a judgment pro or con against anybody. It's just sort of how we are as various human beings at various points in our development. But if you want to make change happen, it's really very worthwhile to be able to see as part of your role, building an alliance, a partnership, a good conversational relationship with a principal, and to be able to say, I think we're both here to make school better for more kids. And because of the unique role I play, sometimes I get some ideas about things that seem like they would be useful, and I'd love to be able to come and talk with you about those things. Depending on the principal, sometimes instead of saying, let's try this, it's much more of a, I've been reading this thing, or I've been observing some research studies on this, and I just wanted to share this with you. Or have you ever thought about this? What if we were able to move just one of these things forward? We can teach principals things because they're humans just like us. And so if we're willing to be their partners in learning and we're willing to share ideas with them, we can get much further in a change process. There are things that they can do that we will never be able to do because of their position. One well-known writer about change uses this analogy, which I like. He says when people study why teachers and others will change, they find that as people, we will change either because we see the light or because we feel the heat. And that same person writing a number of years later said, okay, I'm going to change that a little bit. Most people change when they both see the light and feel the heat. Most of you in the audience today are light sources. You can enlighten teachers, help them see a better way, try a new idea, celebrate a success. You can illuminate their world. Principals can do that as well, and of course it's powerful when they do, but a principal can be a heat source, and you cannot. You don't have that authority. And most change comes when there's both that heat and light, and you can enlist principals in being a good light source with you, but you also need to enlist their work as heat sources if that's not already evident to them. They just simply have a position that enables them to do many kinds of things that are not possible for us to pull off as individual psychologists or social workers or curriculum coordinators. So cultivating a partnership with your principal to, over time, share ideas, make suggestions, very, very important in moving an initiative forward. And again, of great service to the students that you represent, if you can see yourself as a person who not only can, but perhaps should be doing that sort of thing. For a sixth principle, I'd like for us to work with the notion of developing a good-sized team that's going to work together in a really critical leadership role that can become much more powerful and have much more outreach than any one person alone can do. Simon Sinek, who told us that starting with why is really important, added to that later that those who know why need those who know what and how. In other words, he's saying that the visionary may not be the best classroom implementer, may not know the most powerful or most recent instructional strategies to use, may or may not know the language that needs to be used to make things move forward. And so you have to have hands that are in there actually doing the daily work over a long period of time, as well as the person who's inspiring and who's going to continue to be a part of the landscape of the classroom. So I want to share with you 3 different ways that I have seen schools build the support capacity to make it possible for teachers in classrooms to change over time. One of the first examples that I observed that was an interesting one and reasonable for this particular school and was incredibly successful, the principal knew that she wanted to continue to be involved in classrooms every day in this elementary school that she led, but she also knew that while she had informed herself well about what differentiation was, she was not a practitioner expert in that way. And her decision was that she actually wanted a staff developer and coach that was a good fit for her school and that was committed to staying with them for years so that the same person would be coming back over and over and could pick up conversations where they left off. And so she looked around very broadly, going to conferences, asking colleagues for suggestions to find a staff developer and coach who was not a part of her school. And when she found a person that she thought was really well informed, coming from the same place her school was coming from, she actually said to the teachers, I've found somebody that I think can really help us with this, but I want to make sure that this is somebody you're comfortable with. So in the beginning, I'm going to ask her to come and spend 3 days with us this summer. I'm introducing the topic to us as she would like to, and I'm not going to come to those sessions. This principal was always in all the sessions that teachers went to. I'm purposely not going to come because I want you to be able to get to know her on your own terms and to see if you think she's a good fit. If she's not, we can look elsewhere. If she is, then I'll talk with her about an enduring relationship. So this staff developer did work with this school over a 7-year period that I observed in the school. She came often during the first 2 or 3 years, maybe 7, 8 times as the 3 years went on, as well as some summertime, which was of longer duration. Almost all of her work with the teachers, I'd say 90% of her work after the first 6 months, was in teacher classrooms. When she was there, they'd always have meetings of the whole faculty, but they'd be talking about what was going on in the classrooms, what she saw, what questions they had, and almost everything was in the classroom with a particular teacher, helping that person move forward, very much as Hattie talked about the teacher moving forward in +1, just exactly like we want the teacher to help the student move forward in +1. The principal had lots of other assigned roles. One of the people who had an assigned role for leadership in that school was a media specialist who was absolutely amazing as a catalyst for teacher change in being more responsive by using both her capacity to model in the media center, but also in her capacity to help teachers develop books and research projects and support systems and alternative media and many things like that. So there were lots of folks. Grade level chairs had responsibilities for making differentiation a positive force. Assistant principals did. She had parents with really important roles to play as well. But what she did was to hire a staff developer, a coach, who stayed with them and was able to help them pursue together a common vision over time. This is a school that had some financial resources. The staff developer was from another state and so flew in multiple times over those years. A second school, a high school that I was working in at about the same time, did not have extra money and could not have hired a staff developer to fly in and do that repeatedly over an extended period. So the principal chose maybe 6 teachers a first year and sent them to conferences and institutes so that they could become accomplished and comfortable in beginning a differentiation journey in their classrooms. And as she watched them, she saw several of them that she thought had the capacity not only to do really excellent responsive teaching at a high school level, but also to work with their colleagues in that end. And for that purpose, she ultimately asked one of the teachers, who was a young man that taught maybe history, if he would be willing to teach half the day and be a teacher liaison for the second half. And so for the next several years, he taught his own classes and modeled differentiation and polished ideas and figured out what he wanted to throw away. And then in the afternoon, he worked with teachers again individually, in small groups, by department, in staff development meetings, developed a huge amount of trust in a school that was in some trouble and could have been a very sticky place to work at the time. Lots of people had responsibilities for the change. The assistant principals did, the counselors, the specialists in classrooms, her faculty council, department chairs, each had specific responsibilities for things that they needed to attend to. But this teacher liaison was really critical in what was great success in moving that school-wide for effective differentiation. The third example that I want to share with you is one that I've seen real commonly, and that is where a principal says, you know what, we have a lot of knowledgeable people here about how to reach out to meet needs of kids who have different learning needs, so I'm going to make an official differentiation team, and that team will have on it special educators, educators of advanced students, second language teachers, reading specialists, math specialists, whatever was available in that school, guidance counselors, sometimes media specialists. And each one of these people, I expect to still be doing their work. In other words, in a classroom to show somebody how to differentiate for advanced learners, or to show somebody how to differentiate for a student with a learning disability, or a student who has both a learning disability and is advanced. But at the same time, that principal made it important for those various members of that team to meet together weekly to talk about how they could develop a plan to help the whole school move along. And the general idea was that while they would retain their specialty in whatever subset of teaching they identified with, they also would become specialists in differentiation and would share with one another expertise that they thought their colleagues could take into classrooms with them. So maybe to say to a teacher who's a second language teacher or a media specialist, when you have a student with a learning disability that impacts reading, here's something you can try with them. Or when you have a student who really has major difficulty following multi-step directions, here's a couple of ways you can handle that. And so over time, that was a particularly powerful force. 7 or 8 people who worked with kids with all sorts of exceptional needs, people who had resources like a media center that could really contribute to that. And the idea was that as often as it was possible, you would be an emissary for differentiation to a classroom, and not only there to work with 1 or 2 particular students or categories of students. In all of those cases, these teams gave much, much more power to what Seneca is talking about with the how and the what. And if you'll remember the image of the 4-part progression of learning in the previous principle, they didn't ask teachers just to go from, okay, here's what differentiation is, to go do it, but really had all sorts of graduated support and expertise in the class with teachers often. I want to say again that all of these principles made it a point to be in the classrooms really frequently, having conversations with teachers, learning from teachers, helping tighten things, but they did not see themselves as the sole or even primary staff developer. In other words, they understood the difference between their role of a visionary and the person who really is qualified to do the nitty-gritty of actually how you make these classrooms work, how you set them up, and so forth. So principle number 6, we've looked at how to have a vision that guides, motivates change, being very clear about what differentiation is, understanding why it's hard for teachers to sort of wrap around these changes in the beginning, understanding both the power and the challenge of second-order change, making alliances, partnerships with the principal in order to make sure that you have someone on the team who's both a visionary, a real leader, and a light source as well. and building a differentiation team to actually give capacity. Let's take a look now at a seventh key principle of creating a blueprint for successful change to more responsive classrooms. Principle number 7 is the importance of knowing where you're going, not just at a definition, but having really clear learning targets. What is it teachers will really have to know and understand and be able to do if they become proficient at meeting a range of needs in their classrooms? I'm going to start again with another story here, which I'll try to make quick. In my first year at the university, I had a wonderful opportunity to observe in a middle school in Michigan. They actually wanted me to come, which seemed amazing to me. And the teachers there were a terrific group of teachers, bright, and many of them had long careers in that school and were excited about the work that they did. But there was a tension in that they felt that people in the building, leaders in the building and at the central office, kept saying to them, you have to differentiate instruction, you have to differentiate instruction. And the teachers kept saying to me, we already do that, and they just don't ever come in the classrooms, and if they came and saw us, they'd know we were doing it. Funny thing was, I was having trouble finding it as well in the classrooms, and I finally wised up and started saying to the teachers when I went in, when I see you differentiate today, what will I see you do? And one of the teachers even said to me, why didn't you ask us that sooner? And I thought to myself, because I'm not very smart, I guess, but they told me what it was they did when they differentiated. And in fact, I could see those things. I just never had really thought of that as differentiation. They would say things like, I let them choose who to sit with, or if they finish work, they can read early. None of those things were bad, but I just didn't see them as terribly rich and meaningful in the grand scheme of things. And so I made 2 discoveries at this point, and one of them I've already mentioned to you, and that was there was no common shared definition of differentiation, which enabled every teacher to define it however they saw it. And by that definition, they nearly always did whatever it was. But it went a little bit further than that. After I'd been there for 3 or 4 months, one day I was making a brief presentation after school to the teachers, and I put up a continuum of growth with differentiation. When we do no differentiation, it probably looks like this. As we begin, it might look sort of like this. As we move along, we might add some of these things, or you might notice these traits. When we get really strong with it, it probably looks more like this. And I could see that the teachers were really watching that. And a big percentage of the faculty came up when the session was over, and some of them waited quite a while to make a brief comment to me. And their comments were almost always the same, and that was, I'm about right here on that continuum. And they could accurately and willingly point to where they were in development. That had never been clear to them before. They thought differentiation was something you did or didn't do. They did it, life was fine, move on. Once they began to realize that there was a continuum of development, they could accurately and willingly see sort of where they were and what a next step would be for them. Really critical to have those sorts of clear targets for teachers that we can begin to present to them at the right time to be able to say, let's see where you're developing and what areas you have the greatest strengths and how you might move forward in those areas of strength. Now let's look at an area where perhaps you don't think you've developed quite as fully and talk about what we can do to help you move forward from there. So I want to suggest to you a couple of resources that, again, aren't particularly helpful to look at here on the screen, but will be in your resource guide, and I hope can be useful to you in conversations that you have with teachers that you can converse with principals, in planning staff development, and in thinking about your own work, for that matter, if you are in a practice where you actually have to make plans for students and help move them along. So one thing I'd suggest to you is a list of KUDs for teachers. What is it teachers need to know, ultimately, not all on the first day, but ultimately, what do they need to come to know over time in order to have the language of differentiation, which helps them build a base for thinking and planning? What is it they need to come to understand? And some of these understandings will come more quickly for different people, more slowly for different people, some faster with some understandings, and so on. And ultimately, what do they need to be able to do? And how do I, as a leader of these teachers, help them encounter these things, internalize them, translate them into practice, think about their own work, be reflective in regard to these things? How can I become more facile in helping them see where it is they're trying to go precisely and how they're developing in that way. And a second tool, which is even more complicated for a small screen, but I think is useful, is this matrix or continuum of teacher growth in differentiation. Again, differentiation is not a binary. It's not you do it or you don't. It's on or it's off. It's a growth sequence like everything else in life and in teaching. And so if we look along the left-hand column at those 5 turning cogs that we talked about earlier in principle number 2, we can talk about what a learning environment looks like when it's not working too well for kids, and when it gets a little bit better, and when it gets better still, and when a teacher is really very proficient in creating what John Hattie calls an invitational learning environment for all kids. We can talk about that in curriculum. What does it look like when we aren't particularly artful with curriculum? How does that evolve over a period of time? The same with assessment, instruction, leadership, and management. Of course, I would never want to just plunk this down on a teacher's desk and say, this is it. You know, let's plan to get all the way across into all these things. But using one strip at a time, or just showing part of the columns and saying to teachers, where are you with this? And it isn't, by the way, that you're completely in one column. You might have some attributes from the second column and some from the third in one particular class period in learning environment, for example. But having this clarity about what the indicators are of differentiation and what the foundational knowledge, understanding, and skill is to help move those indicators is really, really important. And again, important for people like you to develop a strong comfort with, to talk with principals, to be part of planning staff development, to use in conversations with the teachers you work with, to think about in your own work, can help us really build much more substantial, potent change in a school than we would be able to do otherwise. Principle number 8 in the Blueprint for Student Success in responsive classrooms is one that also relates back to some other things that I have mentioned to you briefly. And that is, what kind of professional development really, really helps teachers change? And what we know about that is that professional development that changes teachers' practice takes place largely in their classrooms, not out of their classrooms. So let's look at that idea for a couple of minutes and relate it back to some things that we've talked about earlier. I spend some time in schools doing presentations for whole faculties or regional service centers or other school-type entities. And some folks call that training. It's just presenting to teachers with hands-on, hopefully with video images, hopefully with plenty of time for conversation. But what I'm there is to do is to share information with teachers. That has a place, but its place is early in that change process. What is it we're talking about? What is this thing? Why might it be good for kids? What does it look like when it's working okay? Can you see yourself in this? What questions do you have? Which of these elements works best for you already? What are you doing there? That training has a place, but it is not going to transfer forward into significant implementation for very many teachers. Very few teachers who attend just training will do anything differently in their classrooms. And here are some things that we know about that. Art Costa, many years ago, talked about the teaching learning process as having 3 stages. Input, where a teacher teaches something to kids. Sense making, where they have a chance to practice it, own it, figure it out, ask questions, so that it kind of comes to belong to them. And then at some point, after lots of input and sense making, we ask them to do output. Show us what you can do with this. The same thing has worked well for me in thinking about planning staff development for change for teachers. Many of you already plan such staff development, and many of you are a part of such staff development, and many of you could be facilitators of change, again, by aligning your interests with a principal to see if you can be a catalyst to shape some policy and decision-making there. So input can happen when we have a staff development day with a trainer, for example. It can happen when you have a PLC doing a shared reading. It can happen as individual teachers or the whole group watches videos online. can happen when a group of teachers decides to pursue a particular instructional strategy, or a particular grade level decides that they'd like to emphasize an approach for a unit that they're working with. And that's great, because you got to learn something. There's a point at which you need to see some things that become a bit of a foundation for moving ahead. But once you've seen those things in the initial sort of staff development, there needs to be an impetus for you to think and plan with those things. Our expectation is that you will use one of the two things that we've talked about in your classroom in the next 2 weeks, and that we'll see that in your lesson plans, and then we'll come together to talk about it, see what works, what doesn't work. Okay, if it doesn't work, you learn something that way. What do you need to change before the next time? Frequently, this sense-making, which is shorter term, one strategy, try something in one lesson, works really well when you have one of those differentiation teams in your school, or someone who is a specialist who can come in and be a second pair of hands in the classroom with you. Ultimately, you need to polish it, get it right, and try it out in your classroom. Frequently, again, our difficulty is we do the input stage and then we quit and nothing ever happens. Here's what folks who have studied this over a period of time tell us, and this is kind of interesting. If you're doing discussions, trainings, lectures, reading, so forth, that actually helps teachers learn some stuff. And in the short term, 5 to 10% of teachers may try that out in their classrooms. And long term, maybe 5 to 10% of teachers will be using it in their classrooms. If you do not only those first things, but you have some folks like some of you who can go into the classroom and model and demonstrate something for somebody, that really improves their knowledge. It's a positive effect on knowledge. And in the short term, between 5 and 20% of teachers will use some of what they've learned. In the long term, between 5 and 20% will use what they've learned. If I do the background material and the demonstration, and somebody comes into the classroom to plan with you as a teacher, and that can be somebody on the differentiation team, a faculty liaison person, a coach, a staff developer, whatever, the principal, 80 to 90% of people will do something in the short term, and only 5 to 10% if the heat source and the light source kind of vanish on them then. But if you get the background, the demonstration, the planning of units that are related directly to that teacher, and peer and collegial coaching, 90+% of teachers using things in the short term and 90+% in the long term. So to whatever degree you conduct staff development for teachers, and to whatever degree you can influence how staff development is put together, not only does it need to be over a long period of time and responsive to the individuals in it, but it needs to be in a sequence like this, with most of the work that's done in classroom-based, very teacher-relevant work, and involving peers, colleagues like you in that work. Really potent to know the kind of staff development we do makes such a difference. If I had a nickel for every time someone has said to me, oh, yeah, we did differentiation in our school last year, I would be a very rich person. Two things there. What that usually means is they had a speaker and they read a book. Not a bad thing, but not nearly enough. Principle number 9 in developing a blueprint for success is very important as well. And it's one that many of you who have responsibilities at the district level can try to influence. One of the biggest problems that we have, and it's why so many people say we did differentiation last year and then moved on, is because there's so many things coming at us that we have what one person called Christmas tree schools, where we just put up one ornament after another ornament, and the more ornaments, the better, but there's really no depth with anything that's happening. So what does initiative overload mean, and how can we contend with that? Michael Fullen, who's one of the great architects of understanding school change, says the main problem is not the absence of innovations in school, but rather too many disconnected, episodic, fragmented, superficially adorned projects. We have so many things coming that it makes teachers crazy. And the notion of really sticking with one of those over time becomes just almost impossible to consider. When in fact, if we're careful and we choose an initiative that has great impact and power potential, we can find many other things that we need to do sort of in that same context. So one school that I worked in that I thought did a really nice job with this really worked from a vision that our students are becoming more and more diverse in their backgrounds and academic needs. And for the foreseeable future, our emphasis, our foreground emphasis, is going to be on creating academically responsive classrooms for those kids. And the principal's pledge was this: unless I have absolutely no choice whatsoever, I am not going to ask you for the next several years to do things that don't align with this goal. And when we ask you to do something that we believe aligns with the goal, we're going to show you how that's the case. So, for example, after several years, they had been talking about some of the things on the left-hand part of the umbrella. What does it mean to teach for understanding? And how do you teach for understanding with English language learners? How do you teach for understanding the students who might have some cognitive difficulties in learning? What does understanding race and culture and gender have to do with the language we use in classrooms, with how we set up invitational learning environments? What does it mean to teach up? How do we do challenging teaching for all kinds of kids rather than teaching down to some kids and up to others? What would it look like if we were doing deep learning in our classes instead of surface learning? But they never presented any of these things as a whole new thing. It was, how do we use this idea to reach more kids better? Within the next couple of years, when I had a chance to be in the school, there was a big emphasis at the district level on using new technologies. But for this faculty, everything that was presented was how do we use these technologies to reach a broader range of students effectively. And the principal said to folks who came in the building, particularly those who were doing training, don't talk with these folks about an app or a program or a piece of hardware with the notion that that's what they're here for. Always show them how this particular app can be used with kids who have varying needs. Always show them how they might be able to use this piece of hardware to create learning centers or learning stations. So it didn't mean that they stayed in sort of the old days with their thinking and never discussed another thing for the next 10 years. But what it did mean was that the principal blocked out whatever he could. And when he couldn't, he made it absolutely imperative that the emphasis be on how the new thing could be useful in the overarching goal that they had. Wonderful way to cut down on initiative overload. So is there a way to do effective teaching for all learners? Doesn't have to have a name like differentiation, but reaching every student. And is there a way that you could consolidate those things that you really need to talk about so they're all taking you in that direction? And now I want us to look briefly at the 10th principle, which is an extraordinarily powerful one, and that is any of us who work with teachers in any way that we possibly can need to model for teachers exactly what we ask them to do for students. And that means in our own individual work with them, in the staff development that we plan for them, in the way that the school operates, in the way that we interact as human beings. So let's take a look at that for just a minute. Albert Einstein says example isn't another way to teach. It's the only way to teach. And I have found over the years that one of the most powerful things we can do to commend differentiation and to make it seem worth someone's while to ponder doing that and ultimately to do more and more of it is to model that. So I want to go back to the 5 key elements of differentiation that we looked at early in the presentation. But I want to flip this around a little bit to you now and suggest an analogy that when we're trying to help teachers become more responsive to kids, the principal becomes to the teacher what the teacher needs to be for the student, or the staff developer becomes for the teacher what the teacher needs to be for the student, or the co-teacher in the classroom becomes for that teacher what the teacher needs to be for the student, and so on. Successful leaders for differentiation will work with teachers in the same way that they'll ask teachers to work with their students. In other words, teachers learn in the same way that kids do because we're all human beings, and teachers need responsive instruction just as kids do. Modeling for teachers what we want them to do with students is also a surprisingly potent advertisement for differentiation, and rarely do teachers miss that point. In the end, teachers will do better in creating responsive classrooms if they feel autonomy, mastery, and purpose. You love a job in which you feel in control. Don't like them when you feel controlled. You like a job better when you feel like it's extending your full potential and you're growing. Don't like it so much when you feel like you're stagnating. Like it much better when you have a vision and feel like your work makes an impact. Don't feel so good about what you're doing when you feel like your work doesn't have much of an impact on anybody, doesn't really make a huge life difference for anyone. We need an environment in which we come to trust the leader, in which we grow in collegiality and trust of each other, and in which people who are leaders like you have helped us trust in the work. In other words, coming to see that differentiation really is something that we can not only do, but that we can do with great benefit to our students. We're just about to reach the point in the session where we'll open up for questions. So let me see if I can capsule what I hope you may take away from our session today. The work that needs doing on behalf of kids with learning differences is way too great for one leader, even the most promising leaders, to accomplish. And so for that reason, we need educators at all levels who see themselves as leaders as well as practitioners of a particular subset of the discipline. And we need leaders who can and will do what's necessary to contribute to decision-making and practice that's responsive for kids. In other words, one of the things that I'd like to be real clear on today is that every one of you already practices some leadership potential. You wouldn't be in the roles you're in if you didn't. But that potential can grow. And the more you're willing to invest time and energy in being a leader for kids, as well as a practitioner of the job that people sort of hired you to do, the better off we'll be. We can't make change happen without that concerted leadership effort. So I hope those 10 principles have been useful to you. I'd like to thank again the folks who have hosted us today. Clay, who has been watching out for everything and making sure things are going okay, and we'll pick up in just a minute and open us up for some questions. Particularly would like to thank you for your time and your interest and your consideration in being here today. And I hope that you will find it useful to think about your own growth as a leader, as well as your own growth in a person who implements responsive instruction in one way or another for students.
Carol, thank you. That was fantastic. I see why your presentations are always packed here and all that. So a lot of listener questions here. You got a very engaged crew on this morning, which is exciting to see. So we'll go right to those. The first listener question is, how can we differentiate instruction in overcrowded, underfunded public schools where teachers have too many students who have diverse needs?
So I think that question is probably the question of the universe in classrooms. It really doesn't matter where I'm working with teachers, what country, what kind of school. Everybody's sense is there's just too much stuff coming at me and I can't. There are too many kids, too many needs, too few dollars, too little time, just can't do it. I met a woman in New York who first struck me as sort of a relic. She looked like a hippie from the 1960s who'd been at it ever since and probably wasn't young in the 60s. And I thought, oh my. And she was telling me that she works in some very complex schools in New York, trying to help teachers move along with their work. And she said she goes in and she hears people always say this same thing about differentiation. I can't because of this, because of this, because of this. And she said, I'll listen and I'll nod and I try really hard to be attentive to what they're saying. And then I say to them, I understand what you're saying. Now let's do something. And I think that's really pretty powerful. She also, by the way, which I thought was really powerful, said, I've been doing this for about 60 years and I still get up every morning and think to myself how really lucky I am to be able to make an impact on schools. And I think that's a great way to face the day full of this kind of question. You do something one step at a time. And if we wait until the conditions are perfect, our schools will be even more diverse and we will have more students who are hurting every day. I think the really hard part is to help teachers see a first step and to take that first step and to understand how it leads to the next step. We can't get rid of underfunding, overcrowding, too few books, too little time. That's not going to happen. So we have to have some very clear targets and preserve space and energy for those things and work together against some of the things that work against us. But the truth is we move ahead one step at a time. I don't know that this illustration is helpful to you, but it was really powerful to me. I often hear from teachers, I don't know how they can expect me to do this. I have 25 kids in my class. And then I'll hear from somebody who says, I don't understand how they can expect me to do this. I have 30 kids in my class. And then sometimes I'll hear 35. And a couple of weeks ago, I heard somebody say, but we have 15 kids and only one assistant. And I thought, mercy, don't say that out loud because most of the world will think you've died and gone to heaven already. I got an email from a teacher in China, and she said, I really love teaching and I really care about my students. And I've started working with differentiation, and I want to tell you 4 or 5 things that I'm doing that really are making a difference, and I'm so excited. And so she explained those to me. And then she said, despite the fact that I'm doing these things and I can really see a difference, I have some challenges. And so I wrote to you to ask you just one question. Can you think of any strategies that are particularly helpful in a classroom that has 90 students? And I thought to myself, well, that's instructive in some way because she's found a number of things to do in her class with 90, and she hadn't given up looking for the next thing. We can organize ourselves when the first baby comes home from the hospital and it feels and looks really different than it did when just mom and pop were there alone. And then the second kid comes and we think, oh my goodness, I'm so glad they're here, but wow, 2 is a little more complicated than 1. And when the third one comes, it's sort of like, woo, I don't know how we ever did that. Now we've got 3 kids, a dog, and a cat, 2 jobs, soccer, whatever else it is, I don't know. But we reorganize ourselves for it. And we can do that in classrooms. We need people to sort of do what the elderly hippie said. I hear you. I understand the burden is there. I understand that it's significant. Let's figure out what we can do in the light of that. And there are many, many things that we can do.
Great. 15 students does sound pretty great.
Yeah, it did.
Depends on the students, though, right? So are special educators viewed by teachers and administrators as a way to avoid school-wide differentiation? How can we become part of the solution?
I love that question. I really think you could substitute the notion special educators in there. ELL classrooms play that same role. Special programs for gifted play that same role. Remedial reading settings play that same role. And the big question is, why don't we just put all these kids in a room where they belong, and then we won't have to worry about them, and that one thing that we sense as a burden will be taken away. And of course, everything in life depends on the lens through which you're looking at it. But for me, I grew up in the Deep South in a time where I can remember hearing on the radio politicians using the notion of separate but equal schools. And thinking as a 12-year-old, that doesn't sound right. And I've become such a believer that we live in a world together and that school is the first place we experience that world. And if we have people to shepherd us in understanding one another and appreciating the value of each person in the world and listening and looking for the contribution of others in our lives, we'll be in a very much better place as individuals and as a society. That's my bias. I'm sure it's not the bias of everyone, but I do think there's a fair clump of us who see that. And in that case, if all of us are working together to say our first goal is to serve these kids well, and we're going to start with the general ed classroom. We're going to do everything we can to make that work. When we need different kinds of assistance, we'll talk about that. We'll see what we can do. But first, let's try it out in the regular classroom and work to say, clearly there are times when kids who have just come to this country and have no language may need a little while in a special context. Personally, I'd prefer it not be the whole day or the whole year. Clearly, there's some kids who are going to have a resource room because of the learning difficulties they have. I've taught 12-year-olds who went straight to college and did remarkably well. And the only reason they went was because they were getting nothing in public school that made any sense for them. And those kids might not have been able to be well integrated into a regular classroom. But I think what we need to be saying is the question is not in what room do these kids get their needs met. In other words, some special setting is the only way. But how do we work together to find the best way? And I think special educators become part of the solution by being willing to say, yes, a part of my job is working with a specific set of kids in a particular location to which those kids come, but I also want to be a part of their success in your classroom, or a part of the success of kids in your classroom who won't make it to mine, but who need some specialized help. And that's one of the reasons I think differentiation teams are so powerful.
We have a little chat here. There are two people who said they had tears coming into their eyes when hearing you say that. So thank you for sharing that. Here's another question. With limited budgets and more duties, classroom teachers have had less time to make differentiation meaningful. How can SLPs and other specialists best partner with teachers?
One of the suggestions that I would make based on experience in watching schools where people are really trying to do things that are helpful and some turn out to be less helpful and some more, is that SLPs and other specialists would do really well to kind of think of their time in an analogy that may not be the best one to use in public, but it comes to me, to set up their time so that they say to themselves, during this year, I have a lot of teachers I need to work with and make an impact on. And if I'm not careful, I'm going to go run from one to the other, to the other, to the other, and by the end of the day, I hardly even remember where I was because I couldn't stay still in anybody's classroom for longer than 15 or 30 minutes. And sort of clump the teachers that they're going to work with into those that they're going to baptize and those that they're going to christen. In other words, some they're going to really dunk deep into the water here, and some they're going to share as much information with as they can in a lesser time. If you could work with two teachers for at least an hour every day for a semester or even better for a year, and those are teachers who want to work with you, by the end of that year, you would have two very strong allies. You'd have two model classrooms. You'd have two places where you could video and use the videos with other folks. You would have classrooms to which other teachers could come and watch. You could have a pair of arms helping you with helping other teachers. So I would try really hard not to spread yourself so thin that you really can't make an impact on anyone. Find a few teachers that you're going to work with long and intensely, and then others in a more hurried way that's necessary, and then rotate that as time goes on. And then I think also a really important piece, which sounds very trivial, though I'm sure some of you had the wrong experience with this, is to have an agreement between the teacher in whose classroom the SLP is working and the specialist, him or herself, that's established, sanctioned by the school principal, saying teacher A agrees to do this, teacher B agrees to do this, here's what our expectations are. And among those would be that when the SLP is working in the classroom, the teacher is working with the SLP, not at her desk grading papers, not out trying to mimeograph things, not doing tomorrow's lesson plans in the back of the room, but actively engaged in that process. Second thing I would say is to go back to the idea from a little while ago of today I'd like to model something for you. Let's talk about what would be most helpful and how that fits into your lesson. I'm going to model it for you the second time after we've talked, and so that you can ask some questions and we can, tailor it better to you, and I'll model it again. Then we're going to meet together and we're going to talk about how you're going to pick that up. And I'll be in the classroom to observe, to provide a second pair of hands. After that time or the next time, then I'm going to be in here to watch what you plan on your own. And then I'm actually going to have to go work with somebody else for a week or so. And so I want to see what you're going to be doing while I'm gone. I'll check back in with you after school once or twice, and I'll come back in again. But leave the teacher alone with the expectation that they actually are doing something. rather than it kind of becoming, which I see too often, he's coming in the classroom today, I get a break, that's really nice. The second thing is that nobody has any time in school. And so consequently, if you're not careful, you have an SLP going into a general classroom, and the two people never have any time to get together. That agreement needs to specify a time and place when folks will get together, even if it's only for 15 minutes, and that 15 minutes becomes sacred. You're not late to the appointment. You don't expect people to stay longer. You have your questions and materials ready during that planning time, whatever will work for you. But I guess what I'm saying is structure the time thoughtfully and impactfully so that you have reason to believe that the way that you're using your time will have maximum benefit on teacher growth.
So we probably have time for one, maybe two more questions here. The next one is, how do you get teacher buy-in? How do you get teacher buy-in to differentiate in classroom instruction, especially with more seasoned teachers?
I think we get teacher buy-in, in lots of ways, just like you do with kids. You know, you might ask yourself, how do you get the most reluctant kid to join you? And I honestly think often in a classroom, that's with a relationship. It may not always be a cuddly relationship to start with, but at least where you're honest and you can say, you know, I know of 3 kids in here who would really benefit if together we could figure out a way to do something a little bit different from them. Are you game for doing that with me? That's at least honest if it's not cuddly. But helping the teacher understand that you're not there to make anybody's life harder. You're actually there because you'd like to make a kid's life easier and to make theirs feel a little more successful. I think stories that you share. We saw a principal one time who brought in several high school kids who had graduated, and he videotaped a panel with them and showed it to teachers later with the kids talking about what had made such a positive difference in their schooling in that place and what had been really hurtful to them. And it was clear that the kids weren't calling names or trying to spite anybody. They were just being reflective. And when you hear the kids say, you know, it would have been so much better for me if somebody had noticed that I really couldn't read those books and had done something to help me, because once somebody did that, I got much better. Or for a kid to be able to say, you know, all the way through high school, I really struggled. And then a college faculty member actually said to me, you know, I think you learn much better when you listen first and then read. And when that happened, the student found that reading textbooks was not nearly as an efficient big picture understanding mode as listening to what people said, whether it was online, on tape, in a class, whatever. Help teachers see that things can change and that they can make a difference. And then one of the things that I think is really, really often is go work with that teacher for an early win. Do something in that teacher's classroom that's likely to be successful, even if it's small. And most of us as teachers, when we can see something that actually makes a difference for a kid, find it a little bit harder to keep pushing with the yes buts. I would also say that it's important not for us to go in and say, let me show you this thing I know how to do. But let's watch some kids and see what might be useful. And then let's talk about 2 or 3 choices that we might use and decide which of those would be most useful to the kids and that feels a little bit more approachable to you, so that the teacher has as much voice as possible as well.